Starting with part A of our lab experiment for intermolecular forces on solutions, we're taking 15 different test tubes and we're adding 2 chemicals to each test tube. In the first test tube, we add acetone and butanol, and we mark down the first meniscus we see, and then we add the second chemical, and then we see whether or not they mix together and they're soluble or not. This one happened to be soluble. The next mixture is acetone and CCl4, which also was soluble. Acetone and ethanol was the third, which also was soluble. The fourth test tube contained acetone and hexane, which we found was soluble. The fifth contained acetone and dehydrated water, which also was soluble. The sixth test tube contains butanol and CCl4, which was soluble. This means that we couldn't see the meniscus once it mixed together. Test tube number 7 was butanol and CCl4, which was insoluble. Test tube number 8 was butanol and hexane, which was partially soluble. This means that the meniscus moved from the first spot that we marked it when we put the butanol in to either higher up or lower, but it didn't mix in completely. Test tube number 9 contained butanol and DH2O, and we found that that was insoluble. And test tube 10 contained CCl4 and ethanol, which also was insoluble. Test tube 11 contained CCl4 and hexane, which again, like butanol and hexane, was partially insoluble, so the meniscus moved, but it did not mix completely. Test tube 12 contained CCl4 and DH2O, which was insoluble. Test tube 13 contained ethanol and hexane. This mixed together, and we could not find the first meniscus, which means it was soluble. Test tube 14 was ethanol and DH2O, which also mixed all the way. And the last test tube contained hexane and DH2O, and this was insoluble. Part 2 of our experiment, we weighed potassium nitrate, and it weighed 10 grams, and then we put those potassium nitrate into a test tube, and then we measured out 5 milliliters of H2O into a separate graduated cylinder, and then we poured the potassium nitrate into the test tube that had water in it. We then took the test tube that had the mixture of potassium nitrate and 5 milliliters of H2O, and we put that into a beaker filled with 5 grams of water. And we held it in the water over a heating pad to make it boil. And then we stuck a thermometer into the test tube so that we could measure the temperature of the mixture of potassium nitrate and H2O. And we stirred it, and this took a very long time for us to find the first crystallizations. And we read the temperature at which we saw the crystallizations, and then we added 5 milliliters of water again and waited for it to find the crystals in the mixture, and we repeated it a total of 4 times. And that was the end of experiment 3.